Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to join us for THBD's April e-learning series webinar. Today, we're really excited to have Cynthia Rando, founder and CEO of Sophic Synergistics, a consulting firm focused on optimizing human performance and experience in any environment, building better businesses by design. Cynthia has spent more than 17 years in the field of human-centered design, including 12 years at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. She's a certified human factors professional and vice president of the Board of Certification in Professional Ergonomics. Today, Cynthia is going to focus on the fundamentals required for the human factors FDA regulatory requirements and how to continue to make progress despite the changes presented by COVID-19. Before we begin today's presentation, Cynthia, I want to thank you for joining us. And I'd like to ask all of our attendees to submit the questions you may have during the presentation in the control panel under your questions tab. We're going to address all the questions at the end of today's presentation. And with that, Cynthia, you can feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Mary. It's sincerely my pleasure to be here today, and thanks to everybody tuning in. This is probably one of the topics that are nearest and dearest to my heart as a human factors professional. And just seeing all the challenges that this country and this planet is facing right now, and especially companies who are really dependent on getting their first products to market, getting stalled or hit in the teeth with a timeline or stay-at-home orders can seem insurmountable. And so we wanted to try to help address that by also helping you frame an understanding for human factors that just by understanding the foundation of what the FDA is asking from you, it'll help you on your way exponentially. Okay, so as Mary said, we've been in the field of human factors for quite some time. We're a little different consulting firm in that we don't just look at human factors from the individual products or services that are being developed, but we also look at it in context of the business that is actually trying to create these products. And to put it in context, especially if you're a medical device company, are you first a US company trying to institute a product in the US, and then you also have goals of opening in the European market, or vice versa. So we really try to understand holistically what the goals of the company is so that we can advise accordingly and help you kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak, to really help in terms of that bottom line preservation. And we're truly industry agnostic. Although medical is the fastest growing area of need for us and probably our biggest portfolio base, we do work with government agencies such as NASA. We work in the tech fields and have worked with Google and Oculus. And also we do consulting on the other side when good products go bad in terms of the expert witness realm and helping when people get hurt or injured by consumer products or get hurt in facilities or things of that nature from bad designs. We're also partnered here because we're in Houston with the Texas Medical Center Innovation Incubator in the ION, and we have, as a result of that, we've been incredibly fortunate to been able to help over 100 startup companies that have gone through this incubator help achieve their regulatory approval. So what am I hoping to accomplish today with you? Well, every one of these topics I could probably go a full hour on. So if that gives you any idea, the topic of human factors is very broad, very deep, and it's what I like to call the unicorn of the regulatory process because it's not very well understood and sometimes it's feared. So I hope to give you a good foundation and understanding of what human factors is. Why is it so valuable to you as a company beyond what the FDA says you have to do? What are the key elements that you have to think about incorporating into your project plan to meet FDA requirements from a human factors perspective? And also considering, a lot of these activities require human-to-human interaction, and how does social distancing play a role in that, and how can we turn lemons into lemonade And how does this translate to virtual success? And what are the key considerations that you have to think about when changing your protocols to a virtual format? And then, one of our number one questions is, how long does it take? Because a lot of times people fear incorporation of human factors as prolonging or delaying their schedule, when in fact it can actually accelerate your schedule and your pathway to market. And so, I always like to start with the real fundamentals of why do we build anything? Why do we develop anything, especially with technology? Technology and products and services are much more than what they are. They are part of a broader ecosystem of why do we need them in the first place? Is there a problem in the universe that is going to be solved by developing this technology or creating this product or service? And when we do that, what is the impact for the end users when we think past the day-to-day use of the item or the ingestion of a drug or the protocol in a hospital? How does that impact current workload, interaction with people on the line, products and services that are already being used within the facility or the environment of use? And so when we think about human factors, it's a lot of things, and you have to think about the entire ecosystem or domino effect of use and implementation. And so a lot of people struggle with just understanding what is human factors. And the most basic answer I can give, and the most fundamentally misunderstood connection, is that human factors is about human safety. And I will say this till the day I die, it is truly the only human safety discipline. Human factors professionals are charged with keeping people safe, making sure that the designs, the products, and the services that we put into place in the marketplace don't harm somebody, but they also help people live life better or optimize what they already do well. And so, I'm pretty biased in favor of the human factors FDA definition. I think it's probably one of the better ones out there in terms of describing human factors. But with every definition, there are limitations. But on the basic point, it's about how people use and interact with technology to optimize our capabilities, but also understanding how we interact, model, and expect the world and things to behave in it, and how do we accommodate that or predict for that and understand the risk involved with that. So again, to summarize this, human factors is really about mitigating human risk, but also optimizing human abilities at the same time. So balancing the scales. And I'm sure, depending on what area you're in or what specialty you've gone into, you've heard a lot of different terms like human-centered design, ergonomics, human engineering, user experience. They all fundamentally mean the same thing, and human factors is the root of the science that supports all of these disciplines and expertise. And they're not all created equal, but they all get at the center of the same thing, human factors. So if you take one thing away from this slide, is that human factors is about human safety and mitigating risk. So, why do we have to care about preventing risk as manufacturers or product developers? Well, people are fallible, we make mistakes, and even though we are incredibly adaptive, we are usually one of many things to go wrong, and usually the last thing in a link of our series of activities to go wrong. So a lot of times you'll hear when there's an accident or someone gets hurt that human error is to blame. Well, that's actually a fallacy. Human error is the easy explanation. Human error just says that someone made a mistake, but it doesn't tell you why that human made a mistake. And that's where human factors and root cause analysis help you proactively prevent those events from occurring that cause that instance of human error. So if you ever hear a company or even in your own situation, if you have a superior or supervisor say, oh, it was human error, they made a mistake, you really need to ask why. And again, it's because other things have gone on that have caused someone to make a mistake. And it can be as far back as on the concept design room floor before anything is built. So why do we make mistakes? Well, if you've started to realize that the rate of technology, especially in the last 10 years, has exponentially increased and is on a rate of change unlike any other we've seen in the past decades. The speed at which things turn over is just so fast. It's really, really hard for us to keep up with change. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it, as I mentioned before, is being able to model expectation and having similar experiences to benefit from, to learn how to use things. But because we don't adapt to change exponentially, even though we have the capability to change that way from a technology standpoint, we are very much a linear animal. We are a stepwise function in terms of how we adapt and relate to technology or changes in our environment and our ability to deal with that and overcome that. And this is why we make mistakes, and this is why modeling risk and understanding of use is so important. And if you're still not convinced from the safety perspective, let's think about when your product goes to market. What other things become your responsibility as product developers or manufacturers? You are responsible for the issues that happen once your product goes to market. And these issues can be things that you were able to foresee during the design and development, and also issues you weren't necessarily able to foresee. And there's more of a nuance here where during the design process, it is your responsibility to think of all the ways someone could potentially use this. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this, and we'll go over a lot of the activities that can help you identify this. But in a court of law, this becomes your responsibility. And you don't want to be on the side of someone who didn't go through the risk analysis process thoroughly. And of course, if you also have to be careful of not making a defense in the case that because you didn't know there was a risk, it's not your responsibility. That won't hold up either. But again, our goal is to be proactive, right? We don't want to get to this point. We want to make sure that our products are safe and usable for everybody. And if you're still not convinced about the value of human factors, well, let's look at the stock market. When we think of all the companies that utilize human-centered strategies as a business model, not just a mechanism of product development, they are by far the ones that are leading the stock market from a design engineering type company perspective. They have the highest margins, they grow the fastest, and they tend to attract positive public opinion as well as high employee retention rates. So they're usually the ones that are leading the standard. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of companies off the top of your head that fit this, like Apple, Samsung, just depending on what type of products that you use at home, you probably have some go-to brands. So now I'm going to shift. Hopefully I've provided you enough basic knowledge to understand the context of human factors, and it's critical to the safe design of medical devices. So when we start to shift and look at the medical device world and the world of regulatory from the FDA perspective, there's three major classes of device. Class 1 is the lower risk. Class 2, you get into more medium risk devices, and Class 3. Now, there's been some sort of old adage that when you're low risk, you don't need human factors, you don't need to do this, and I caution you because that's not necessarily true. The answer about how many things you need to do really depends on what type of device you're developing. And if you're developing something that is brand new to the market where you have no predicate to point to and no history of understanding, even if you're Class 1, the FDA will most likely want to see that human factors analysis and pathway completed. And even in some of the cases where you are a class 1, where there's a lot of predicate devices out there in history, they'll still want you to do an analysis or post-market surveillance and human factors analysis. So again, it's better if you plan for these things on the ground floor, because that'll help you get to market and also be a more successful company in the end. So as many of you know, or I hope you know, human factors is a required facet of the regulatory process. So, above all of the value proposition I told you about earlier, this is required. You have to do it. But again, it's a really hard piece of the regulatory process for folks, and I'll show you some data to back that up. And in 2016, FDA, really tried to help lower that barrier to entry and understanding for human factors by publishing the human factors guidance document. And I think this was a great first step. However, it still left a lot of questions unanswered regarding when, how, why, where do I put this? How do I do this in the right timing with all of the other things I have to do from a project management perspective. So, getting to the planning and execution, and also what's involved with all of these activities. And it truly has become one of the most misunderstood and complex aspects of the regulatory process at times. And it's just because it's a lot more complicated than I think the guidance conveys to people across the board. And so if I were to take it at the 50,000 foot level, and where some of the confusion comes in, if you look at the guidance and you've read through it, it's really written for somebody who already has a basic understanding of human factors like myself, who understands logistically what it takes to get all of these things done. So on the face of it, you see all of these things that are required as part of your project plan and your design file, but you don't get a sense of what you have to plan for in your schedule and where they have to go, and also all the documents from a configuration management perspective when you get to the end of the line is going to be required. You see that you need to do some benchmark analysis. You need to understand, what's out in the world already today. You're told you have to do some formative tests, but you don't quite understand where and when. You have to do a validation test, but how do you do that? And when do you do that? And then the piece de resistance is the human factors engineering report, or the usability design file, that requires many more documents that don't appear in the guidance. And so we'll go into that next. But just to give you an idea, in 2018, during the human factors briefing at our yearly conference, the FDA threw up this slide, and I really thought it hit the point home that, out of all of the submissions that they received that year, very few actually made it past the first time. They didn't get approved the first time, and it was due to issues with their human factors requirements being met. And it's for all of the reasons that I've been talking about leading up to this, the requirements being not as clear. And so, to give you an understanding, you have the guidance document from a human factors perspective that gives you the general lay of the land and points to all the different requirements, but you don't really start getting a good understanding for what that means in terms of designing and project planning until you dive deep into 62366 and also HE 75. So 62366 gives you the general lay of the land, the thou shalt do human factors engineering. This is what it looks like. This is usability. But HE 75 delves deeply into the different design requirements that you have to consider based off of the type of medical device or digital health product that you're designing. And this document, if you've ever seen it, it's 400 plus pages long, and a lot of companies don't ever consult it before they go to design. And so this can be a real critical miss for companies at the beginning, and something that they pay a good price for. And it's not until you get to section 9, I believe, that you see the project life cycle, design life cycle, and all of the products and requirements required to meet the general guidance, or 62366. And so, as I mentioned before, when you get to the HE75 level and you start looking at the actual requirements, that's the first time you see a breakdown of all the design phases and all of the different types of human factors activities that are going to be required at that design phase to meet that design objective or meet that requirement from the FDA side. However, when you read the FDA requirements, they basically in writing require the summative validation test and HFE report, but in order to get to that level, these are all the supporting activities and documents that are required that they'll be looking for from you to have done at the right time within the design process, which is key. So why does this happen? What are the problems that are going on that are causing companies not to be able to achieve approval the first time through, despite all of the documentation? So these are some of the commonly cited issues from the FDA, and I think you're probably starting to catch on to the issues, but integrating human factors at every step of the design cycle. Anywhere you have an engineer in your project, you should have a human factors engineer, whether it's in-house or consultant wise. They are critical even at concept phase. They can help you avoid a lot of mistakes from a human behavior and human design perspective. Another one is understanding who your users are and getting that correct in designing for that population and testing to that population, and also understanding the environments of use. A lot of companies downplay the value of taking the time at the beginning to do observations in clinics, for example, or hospital environments where there is a predicate device already in use, to watch how the staff interact for whatever procedure the procedure of interest is, and how the patient outcome is. And then, of course, we see this all the time, defining your design requirements up front before you design anything, and also understanding and defining user risks. And this also means you become inheritor, for lack of a better word, of anybody else's user risks that's already a predicate on the market. So if you're comparing yourself to a competitor, or you're leveraging the fact that there's a similar device out there, you also have to account for the risks that have been seen using that device on the market and incorporate that into your risk analysis on the ground floor and mitigate for that risk. Make sure you have a clear mitigation plan, and through your design iteration process, make sure you're accounting for buying down risk. Okay, and so through our 5 years of consulting with TMCX, I wanted to do a quick cross comparison in a smaller demographic. But lo and behold, at the end of the day, we see exactly the same issues on a smaller level when we're consulting on the individual basis that the FDA sees. So I completely understand the pain that the FDA feels when they get their regulatory design file submissions. There's a lot of things that are missing or steps that are skipped, but I think it's because of a lack of integrated awareness and understanding of where human factors fits and how to think of it. And if you rewind about 20 minutes to what I said, if you remember nothing else from this presentation and a way to think about human factors, it is part of your safety approach. It is how you risk mitigate from top to bottom.
Yep.
So when we talk about human factors, again, I can't punch this line enough. It's truly your first line of defense in ensuring that not only are you going to have a great and safe product, but you're going to have a successful company. And when we're advising, I can almost always 100% of the time predict which companies are going to do well and make it are the ones who really take this seriously and understand inherently the role human factors plays in making them a successful company. And it's the ones that discount this or see human factors as a roadblock are the ones that fail miserably at the end of the line, or don't understand why even if they, from a safety perspective, they did all the things right, from a market acceptability perspective, their market wasn't there and didn't want to buy it at the end of the day. And so these are other things you have to think of that the FDA may not necessarily care about, but you do because you want to have a viable business. So when we think about the design process and how human factors helps on the ground floor, we have three major ways we look at things. Our first line of defense, and always, always, always is our preferred methodology, is design it out. And we're usually pretty successful if we're included really early on, and this is very cost-effective option at that point in time. The later we're brought in, or the later you wait to incorporate, the more expensive it becomes and the harder it becomes to design things out, because now you have business trade-offs. You have cost and schedule trade-offs that are of equal concern. And so then we get moved into a guard against category. And guard against, it's really how it sounds. If you think of the lawnmower, you can't design out the blades because that's a primary function of the device, but you can put barriers around so that I hopefully don't stick my hand in and get my fingers chopped off because of the blades. And then, our least favorite line of defense is warning, training and procedures, because it's the least effective. Warnings over the last 50 years have been shown to be not as effective as we would like to believe. And, also training is a very hard one, especially if you're not trained to expert level and you get trained in a 20-minute online class and you've got 6 kids in the room or 6 different people talking to you at the same time. How much did you learn? So, there's a lot of complications and why design out is always the safest option. So when we think about the design phases, I'm going to break them down a little bit more specifically for you so you have a better understanding of all of the activities that occur at each step of the design phase. And again, it's hard to understand this as a first-time product developer or service provider type company, because it's not spelled out for you that way in the guidance or in the requirements, and it can be kind of overwhelming. And so when we think of the conceptual phase, this is before you've designed anything. You just have an idea about a product or service. So this is where you should be doing the gap analysis, the research, the benchmark analysis with your competitors, understanding the problems that are inherent right now, do the observations in the clinics that we talked about, do an initial user risk identification based off of that information. You don't have to have a product to be able to develop that. And the FDA is going to look for this somewhere in your design file that you did your homework. You don't want to get to the point of clinical trials, think you're going to come to somebody like me and ask for a summative test validation and think you're going to get it. I'm going to be asking you for all of the stuff from the very beginning to understand how you got to be ready for summative, to understand, if you got all of your questions right, like understanding your users, etc., before we do testing. So the next phase is design requirements phase. And no, you're still not supposed to be designing at this phase. You're supposed to be taking the research that you learned from the conceptual phase, supposed to be now on paper, writing out what are the requirements that you are designing to. Again, not driving it by a technology or a solution, because a lot of times, especially in the software world, a company will just develop something because the technology and the idea is there, and then they write the requirements to fit the product that they've developed. And what happens in this case is you don't even know if you really have a user market. You had a great idea, or someone down the hall said they liked it, and you've decided you've now had a huge user market. So again, this is another huge, I see this almost every day, mistake that companies make. You really need to think about the process and procedure of design before you start developing something, because it becomes a costly mistake if you get to the verification or you get to the clinical trials and you didn't ask all the right questions, or you mismapped in terms of environment of use or user demographics. So after you've nailed down your requirements as effectively as you can, because again, it's an iterative process, so you're going to go back and forth a lot during all of this. But just for ease of explanation, you get to the design drafting phase. And so this is where you're prototyping. This is where you're doing formative usability tests. So this is smaller usability tests basically testing out elements of where you need help in understanding design parameters and where you might need to make design trade-offs, or you need some feedback from the user because you're not sure how they're going to behave with this, or if it's easy to understand, or if it's a process that's easy to do from like a drug delivery perspective. So that's where formative tests are great. They can be done on little pieces of questions that you have to help inform the design space. But what you also have to be thinking of in the background is, how are you documenting this against your user risks? What are you learning in the user tests that translate to new user risks? How are you documenting this in terms of design requirements? Do you now have an issue where you might have conflicting requirements that need to be addressed because you've learned something in the user tests? And so the reason there's stars here is these are activities that are typically done in person. And now when we talk about the COVID-19 situation, they become a lot harder to do from a testing and execution standpoint because of the social distancing, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then once you've done all of your activities in the design drafting phase, you've done all your formative testing, and you've got all your data, and you're very confident that you've produced a very sound, safe, and easily used product. Now you're ready for verification and validation and summative testing. And so summative testing is a little different from formative testing in that as a human factors practitioner, you don't interfere. You test it as if it were a real life situation. Nobody is there to help them to see just how easy and safe this product is to use in a real life scenario. And again, that is also why it's a validation test, because you want to validate what you think to be true, that you've bought down all of your risks successfully, you've met all of your design requirements, and you can say to the FDA, I've done my job as a responsible steward in a company and produced a safe, viable, and medically effective product. And so before I leave this slide, the other biggest thing that is the number one mistake we see is companies, they come to us at the point that they're getting ready to do clinical trials and then learn all of these different elements, activities that they didn't do before that. And so why is it so important that you do all of this before clinical trials? Well, the whole human factors process is set up to what? Make sure you're safe. And the whole clinical trials is your last most expensive test to make sure you are safe and effective. So you don't want to, for lack of a better word, waste all of that time and money on a clinical trial until you know you're safe, until you know your protocols and process and procedures work and everything is sound. That is a risk you don't want to take. And that's what the human factors process also helps you do. It also helps validate that you are ready for clinical trials, if that makes sense. Okay, so again, we've kind of talked a little bit around this, but now that we have different restrictions state by state, different states are opening at different levels at different times. We have different limitations depending on where we live and the demographic we are in terms of human interaction. We've seen all sorts of travel disruptions, and we're experiencing a lot of facility restrictions to where it's not safe or not desirable to go in testing, especially when you're talking about the medical world and medical devices. And now we have to start thinking about civilian PPE, but also, if you're testing and you're in these environments, you have to think about, are you prepared to provide PPE and sterilization protocols? Because the other issue here, the underlying issue that almost nobody considers is, will your participants perceive that your process and procedure is safe for them to be a test subject? So these are all of the issues that social distancing and COVID-19 have handed to us, but it's not insurmountable. And in fact, we were called in at the end of March, beginning of April, to do some emergency testing to help get some medical technology to the VA that would help them be socially distant from having to come into appointments. So again, there's a lot of reasons and rationale why still doing the in-person testing is important, and you can conduct it. And there are trade-offs to where virtual testing, can be done too. And again, it depends situation, and there will be some situations that you absolutely can't test virtually, but you can do all of the background activities we've been talking about successfully as you wait and get prepared to do these things so that you're ready to go to the races. So to that point, when we talk about the conceptual phase, almost every activity, if not all of them, can be done virtually and remotely. Technology is in such a great place to where it helps us do focus groups remotely. And again, the one caveat here, and it's also why I have stars, is because it depends on your user demographic. So we have to think about technology and who it serves and who it doesn't. And so there is a distinct population and an age gap here, to where the older you get and the older population that may be a target for you and your user demographic, they may not be a good candidate for you in terms of virtual testing because they don't have the capabilities in their home, or they're not comfortable. They don't want you to send them an iPad. They don't want to try it, and they don't want to do this. So again, these are some of the questions that you'll need to ask yourself. But for the majority of things, these are activities that can be easily conducted remotely, using things like Zoom and what have you. Now, observations of users can get a little difficult, especially if you're looking for in-hospital process and procedure, but it can be navigated. And so I'll give you an example of a company we're working with. We're actually having the clinic staff record some of their procedures while keeping the patients de-identified for us. We've named out the types of interactions that we're hoping to see. And so they're going to video record, day in the life of these procedures for us so that we can analyze them later, since we can't go into the clinic safely, or it's an unnecessary risk that can be easily overcome. So I hope that makes sense. But all the other stuff is background research type activities, and you can also do surveys in some instances if a focus group doesn't really make sense for you right now. But all the rest of these activities can be done remotely, behind the scenes, with computer-based technology. So when we go to the design requirements phase, again, you're not designing yet, and again, depending on where you are, again, it's the same rules apply. This is the point where you should be going back to the documentation, HE 75, and starting to pick out all of the requirements that apply to you based off of the type of device that you have. Doing some task and workflow analyses to understand where the potential gotchas are until you're ready to do some initial design and development. And again, this is key, is really understanding who your user is at this point in time and who the environment is, and really fleshing out those user profiles and environment profiles of use, and getting an understanding and getting whatever observations done that you need to is key at this phase. And again, a lot of this can be done remotely, and again, if you have to do a focus group, the same trade-offs apply. When you think of design drafting and testing, so this is where it gets a little bit more challenging, but again, it can be done. You can still conduct usability testing. You just have to start asking some questions, which we'll go through in the next slide, about, is it safer to do it virtually? Is it possible to do it virtually versus doing it in person? And what are the reasons you would need to do it in person versus virtually, and making those trade-offs? But user testing can be done, but again, it really depends on the type of product you have and the environment of use situation. And there are situations where you can rent other facilities to mock up, because again, human factors isn't like a clinical trial. You're doing a simulated use test. So you can, if doing this in the normative setting that you would have done it pre-COVID-19 is just a little dangerous, you could rent a secondary facility, and we've done this with some of our clients to where we've mocked up secondary facilities for them. And again, same thing with the verification validation. So the summative test is a little bit tougher to do remotely. I think if you have a lower level class 1 device, and again, depending on how complex it is in the environment of use, I think you could find definite ways to do this remotely, especially with the technology that we have, but your protocols would have to be a lot more specific in terms of how the user is going to act, especially if you've got to ship them technology and how they need to interact. And then you as a facilitator, your role is going to be a little different through this summative test, and you'll have to probably interact a little bit more. You know, my personal feelings are for a validation test, I am always in the court of it's better to do it in person, but there are a ton of workarounds such as PPE and sterilization protocols and temperature checks that can still make that a safe thing, especially since in most cases you're only doing this one-on-one or, you know, two-on-two if you're testing in teams.
Data chat.
Did you get that?
Okay, and so, you know, again, I alluded to this in the beginning.
Might be like
you know,
that. So we'll take a look.
Can someone mute their mic? Thanks. So again, you're going to have to ask yourself some questions as you go through the process and you analyze if virtual is the right choice for you. And again, I did mention some of these, but can the procedure be revised to effectively incorporate virtual test parameters? Is it safe to conduct the activity virtually? Sometimes people in their homes have a completely different situations, and if you're gonna send them something that might be like a drug delivery product, you have to worry about what are they gonna do with it before you enter the scene for testing, right? Would the activity be safer for participants if conducted virtually? So again, you know, these are just, you know, basic questions. And is it practical? So when we go back to the business questions to conduct the test virtually, what is it going to cost you to do this? What do you have to ship to participants? What do you have to do to get them ready to be tested virtually? Do they have access to technology? Are they a demographic that would accept the use of technology or testing in this way? What are the environment of use restrictions to where you would have to model it successfully to meet the FDA requirements? And test designs. Can you do this virtually at home, especially if you're a teaming situation where you have a surgeon and an RN, let's say in a colonoscopy type situation? And then I always say, can you change your protocols to be more safe to actually conduct this still in person? And I think the answer is always yes, but it depends on your specific study parameters. And so this is probably the last slide that I'll have for you today, so I can leave enough time for questions. But this is always the other question that we get is how much time should I plan for these activities when you think about all of the back end research, the design requirements, all of the formative tests that you need to do to show that to the FDA that you did the design iterative process successfully and that you implemented design changes to get to validation. So with your lower risk class 1, it can be anywhere from 3 to 12 months. And again, it just depends on how well you've done all of the back end activities. Mid risk, we say 12 to 24 months. And then high risk, you're looking at usually like a 2-year rollout from the time you start, minimum. And again, everybody hates this, but in the world of human factors, it always depends, and it's because of the type of device that you're doing, the design style, and number of user groups that you have to test, and number of tests that you need to do to effectively mitigate all risk. Okay, so I know that was probably like drinking from a water hose, but I wanted to give you enough of an overview so you had enough information to be dangerous and to ask me as many questions as you wanted to, but at least be able to take some action today, whether it's on the smaller stuff, you know, getting some of that foundational research in place, taking a look at your user risk analysis, understanding that it's much more than your FMEAs that you've conducted, going back and looking at the design requirements. Did you do them justice and writing them out and understanding how they link to risks and your testing protocols? Have you defined in your project plan where these testing protocols belong? And here's a hint: anytime you have a prototype, you should stop a design and test it from a user point of view, so that you can control how you're feeding that back into the design process. And that's it.
Okay, great. Cynthia, I want to thank you so much. Like you said, it was definitely a ton of information, a wealth of information. So want to thank you for your time and everything that you've put together for us. I
Absolutely.
am reading through our questions, and the first one is actually from Tammy. And she asks if you're able to touch on the emergency FDA requirements when trying to get a device fast tracked for COVID-19 use.
So that's another complicated box of stuff. So, with a lot of so I'll take ventilators and surgical masks as a good example for things that have been out on the market that are really well understood and can be fast tracked to the design floor because they have some sort of prior knowledge. The FDA has been really good about relaxing requirements to allow you to do this at a greater clip for the greater good, because again, as I mentioned, it's all about risk and safety. So if they deem that the benefit outweighs the potential risk or the unknown, they're going to fast track you and let you jump over some of these requirements. But that being said, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't necessarily come back and want to have some post-market surveillance or understanding, or for you to do some human factors assessments after you go to market. And again, I use ventilators and surgical masks because that's the low-hanging fruit here. But like we were trying to get some remote monitoring capabilities to market for another company, and although they were in the mode of wanting to fast track this to help the VA, they still required that they needed to complete their validation test to make sure that the users understood, because of the special demographic of use, or the older population. And so fundamentally, we know they have challenges with technology that the rest of us may not have. And so that was still very much a requirement that the FDA levied in this situation. So again, there's not a one size fits all answer. I think it just depends on what data you can bring to show the FDA to make your case.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And let's see, if you can give me just a second, I've got kind of a long one here that I want to make sure I get to you correctly. Okay, this one, this question, I'm just going to read it. So I have the question: most formative and many summative studies are conducted with limited production, highly confidential, fragile, temperamental, or unreliable prototypes. Most of these prototypes require care and feeding by specialized technical support. How can you envision sending these prototypes into the homes of study participants for remote testing?
So again, I think this goes back to the question slide where you have to evaluate safe in a number of ways. So it's safe to your product, safe to your bottom line, and then safe to the end user. So again, I think that's the great question is if it's not a viable candidate for all of the reasons that you just mentioned, then you go back into the candidate, the box of saying, okay, I think we have too many risks here of it not being a very successful test in the home environment. I think we need to bring it back to in-person testing. How can I do that safely? And so then that goes back to process and procedure and protocols. And so again, I'll take the example of when we got called back in. I mean, we were wiping down everything down to the pens and pencils that people were using from participant to participant to ensure everybody was safe. Not only did it make sure that there was no germs and the screening was done, but it also showed people that we were taking their safety seriously, and it helped them feel comfortable in participating in these tests in person.
Okay, great. I think that absolutely, back to your point that safety is first and foremost and key.
Yep.
And just one more, it looks like, Cynthia. Would you recommend contacting the FDA to discuss the fast tracking of surgical masks, other PPE? And what questions, if that is the answer, what questions would you recommend to ask?
Yeah, absolutely, because those are some of the products that have been out on the market and in heavy use, and there's multiple manufacturers. So there's probably a wealth of information and multiple databases to check to see what the issues of use have been. But when you go through the process of fast track with the FDA and you get one of those pre-sub meetings or even earlier in terms of like the COVID process that they put out there, I would ask them what they know in terms of the things that you have to be aware of from a risk potential. But again, do your homework, because what they want to do is they want to have confidence in you that you're taking safety and security seriously of people. So understanding the risk based off the predicate, surgical masks and other products that are out there that you inherit, to make sure that whatever design that you're proposing has accommodated for that risk to the end user. That's what they're going to be looking for.
Perfect. And I don't know if you'll be able to speak to this or not, Cynthia, but for organizations that may already have a prototype mask in place, can you estimate the timeline that would be needed in order to get that into distribution?
Using the FDA's fast track process?
Yes.
That's a tough one, because I think that's still a little bit of a test. I don't really know. I don't know that we've had enough input from the FDA, how many that they've put through the fast track process, to know what the metrics are.
Sure.
But if I were to just think from a design and development perspective, in theory, I think you could go pretty fast, since there is so much predicate data for you to point to that helps you in the design process, to where even if you chose to be a little bit more stringent and conduct some of these studies, you could probably get away with a mini formative test and a validation test, because it's such a low risk type device. And again, don't quote me on that, but
Sure.
that's my feeling towards it. Again, the goal is not to make it harder; it's to get what we need out there. And again, I don't speak for the FDA, but just knowing how they think and approach things from a safety perspective, that would be my gut reaction.
Okay, perfect. I do just want to make a quick note, because we have clearly a lot of interest in your topic and your presentation today, Cynthia. I do want to let everybody know that after today's presentation, a recording will be available on the THBD website, which you can find at templebioscience.org, as well as on the THBD YouTube channel. So we'll be sure that you can revisit this material if you want to, and it seems like quite a few people do. And I'm just going to grab one more question for you today, Cynthia. Do you have any recommendations for online courses that focus on FDA testing?
There was a time that they were doing a few in terms of human factors or clinical trials.
Not specified.
Okay.
Here we go. Human factors. That was going to be my guess.
So once upon a time, they were holding some webinars for human factors way back when. But I remember even myself, like, just in search of a few for reference for my clients, it was hard to get them after the fact, and I don't see that they've been doing very many as of late. That being said, the Human Factors Ergonomics Society, the medical conference that usually happens in March, it got moved to being remote in May. The FDA is almost always a player in that conference, and they do pre-symposium workshops. Again, I know that that's going to be held virtually this year. So if you go on the HFES website, you can probably find that. I'm not sure if you can still register or not, because I forget the exact dates, but that's where, I'll do a lot of checking in to make sure, I'm current with the metrics that they're seeing on their side from submission, so I can advise my clients accordingly.
Okay, I think that's perfect. And we're just about out of time. You definitely answered that question, so thank you so much.
Perfect.
And I'm going to ask you to backtrack just for one last question that I think we can sneak in.
Okay.
How do you handle someone who hasn't done formative work? And the secondary question to that is, do you try to move forward with summative or get them to backtrack?
So there's two ways that conversation can go. So it often depends on how open to listening the company is at that point in time, because again, cost and schedule is always the driving motivating factor at that point, and also clinical trials. So I try to always put the conversation in the context of risk. I explain to them, the risk of us going ahead and conducting this summative test is that we might have to stop it and call it a formative test anyway. And then you're going to have to redo a summative test. And that's happened with some of my clients. They were adamant and convinced themselves that they had done everything possible because they were engineers and they were humans and they'd considered all the risks and designed it out effectively. And so I said, okay. I said, well, this is the risk. I said, and we video record to all of the testing sessions, so that we can show snippets of issues that participants are having to our clients to help them see it from the participants' point of view, not just mine. And that usually sends a good message. But, unfortunately, it does happen. Some people decline the opportunity to save themselves and some money and some time by doing the formative first. But I always say, even if you've done the formative, I always tell clients it's better to plan in a pre-summative test, which is like a formative test on steroids, to make sure you're really ready for the validation test. Because with the formative test, you only have to test 5 to 8 people. With the summative, depending on how many user groups, and again, same with formative, if you have 2 user groups, you have to double that. But with summative, you have to test 15. And so you just don't want to burn all of those test subjects if you're not sure and you're not ready, because in some of these user groups, they're really, really hard to schedule, and that can be the long pole in your tent. And that's another planning thing that tends to go awry for companies. They just underestimated how long it would take to get some of these more higher profile test participants, and especially if you're talking about surgeons or nurses in this climate right now, it's going to be hard to get their time, right? So you need to think through that and what risk you're willing to take with burning test participants.
Absolutely. Okay, well, it looks like we managed to address our questions today. And Cynthia, I just want to thank you again so much for your time and for the wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us, and remind everybody that you can find the recording at templebioscience.org. And again, thank you for putting your contact information for individuals who may want to follow up with you on this last slide. And again, thank you so much, Cynthia.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everybody who attended.
Cynthia, thank you, thank you, thank you. It was amazing, and hopefully it answered a lot of questions that everyone was asking. So thank you again. Stay safe, and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Tammy.
Take care.
Bye-bye.